Can you hear me? Can you also suggest that people make sure that they have their screen set so that they see the slides as the big picture and me just as a little, you know, picture in the corner?
Margaret, that will happen automatically when you screen share.
Okay. Okay. So can everybody hear me? I'm okay. Well, then I'd like to get started.
And I just recommend that everyone put on speaker view first if they don't want to see all the boxes, so they can see you in
that's a
large,
good
right?
idea. Speaker view.
Speaker view, so you can see her is the main event, which she is.
Now, don't we want to move this down? Like, I don't need to see this. I want to just see my speech. All right. Okay, well, good morning and welcome to my third garden tour on Zoom. Now, normally in July, I am on the island of Martha's Vineyard, and Garden Group has to take a break, which always seemed to make sense in this rainy winter month. But nothing now is normal, and we have had to put travel on the back burner. However, thanks to the miracle of technology and the pandemic, we are going to Japan today. I hasten to add, Japan is a country I have never visited or not visited yet. I would particularly like to go, especially to see the gardens and experience their food. No Japanese house, palace, or temple is considered complete without a garden. Japanese gardens, however, have little in common with the grand geometric gardens of France and England, nor are they similar to modern Western gardens with their neat hedges, careful patterns, and colorful flowers that bloom on a rotating basis. Over the last 150 years, gardens have become one of the most exported elements of Japanese culture. The tending of nature and the relationships it creates are universally loved by people of all backgrounds. I believe the overarching principle of Japanese gardens is less is more, a concept that I have not always embraced, but am learning to do so with age. As it happens, there are more Japanese gardens in other countries around the world than there are in Japan. Today, we will be visiting several outside of Japan, including one in Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts, and another on the other side of the US, near the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. I have been to both of these gardens and enjoyed them very much, even visiting with the same friend. And I am betting that everyone here has been to at least one Japanese garden somewhere. As I researched this subject, I began to understand how deeply complex and layered it is. There are many scholarly books on the history and the styles of Japanese gardens. And so as not to get confused or too detailed, I'm going to try and summarize and simplify. To those who know a great deal more than I, and there is so much to learn about this subject, I hope you will bear with me as my talk is not meant to be scholarly, but rather lightly informative. What unfolds is really my journey of learning a little bit about Japanese gardens and those aspects that really caught my imagination. Please sit back and enjoy our visit to Japan and elsewhere, and consider how fortunate we are that we can take a trip while in the comfort of our own homes. You might well ask, why Japanese gardens? Especially as I have never even been to Japan. Well, I was inspired by Monet's garden and his famous Japanese bridge over the water lilies. And here is a slide from my previous talk. I started to think about how much Japanese art and design have influenced the Western world. The French term Japonisme refers to the popularity and influence of Japanese art and design in Western Europe in the 19th century, following the forced reopening of trade with Japan in 1858 and up until the First World War. This is exactly the time that Monet was painting and his garden was flourishing. This is Mount Fuji, perhaps the most enduring symbol of Japan. Today, Japan is a nation of 6,852 islands, and Mount Fuji is the highest point in the country at 3,776 meters, or a little over 12,000 feet. Japan is one of the world's most literate and technically advanced nations, and it is the world's third largest economy. While most of Japan is covered by mountains and heavily wooded areas, the country's 126 million people lead a distinctly urban lifestyle. So the populated areas are very concentrated, while the remainder is very sparsely populated. It's not surprising that in urban areas, rooftop gardens have become very popular, and certainly many Japanese gardens reflect the idea that small is beautiful. Nearly every country in the world has a Japanese garden, a testament to the enduring legacy of Japan's huge influence on the way we garden. They are gardens that seem effortless and natural, and yet all is carefully positioned and managed so that we will experience plants, stone, and water exactly as the garden maker intended. Japanese gardens are about inspiring and soothing the soul. And you don't have to be a gardening expert or a Zen Buddhist to appreciate all they have to offer. The beauty, the tranquility, the connection with nature. There's a very rich, old, and complicated history, and at least 7 distinct historic periods going back to the 7th century, each with their own style and philosophies. The designs of Japanese gardens are closely associated with Japanese aesthetics, religion, and philosophical ideas, and there is an avoidance of artificial ornamentation. Rather, the natural landscape is highlighted. Plants, as well as worn, aged materials, are generally used by Japanese garden designers to suggest an ancient and faraway natural landscape, and to express the fragility of existence as well as time's unstoppable advance. As with most cultures, early Japanese gardens were mostly used to adorn the property of wealthy noblemen or temples and shrines. These first gardens were designed in what is known as the Paradise Garden style, which oftentimes included ponds with lotus flowers, arching bridges, pavilions, and lots of trees. They were gardens created to honor the spirits of nature. The main purpose of a Japanese garden is to bring serenity and nature into our crowded lives. They remind us of the natural landscape, but in fact, they are carefully controlled by man. They are nature-inspired, but they do not grow naturally. Taste, simplicity, quality, and natural patterns are all very important. And naturally, no Japanese garden is complete without the towering presence of bamboo. A beautiful plant of Oriental origin, the bamboo is one of the plants inside a Japanese garden that symbolizes diversity. Bamboo also plays a very vital role in the everyday lives of the Japanese and increasingly in the Western world. For instance, just the other day, I noticed that my mattress was covered in a bamboo fabric. Those of you who watched my French gardens tour may recall this slide showing the path to the Japanese bridge at Giverny. And I said then, note the bamboo on the left because it seems so incongruous. Now I know why. Monet just didn't build a pond with a bridge. He built a whole Japanese garden on the other side of the road, making Giverny one of the very first Japanese gardens outside of Japan. The Japanese garden's most important function is providing atmosphere and surroundings which make day-to-day life happier. There is an attempt to maintain the appearance of nature, but things have been tidied up, stylized, moved about, and manipulated. The Japanese gardener attempts to express nature better than nature does itself. As in any dramatic presentation, the only integrity is that of performance. In short, nature has become a spectacle to behold. In modern Japanese gardens, flowers are few. and evergreens are preferred to that of the changing aspect of deciduous trees. Simplicity, restraint, and consistency are sought rather than gaiety, showiness, or the obvious variations of the seasons. As in the case of stones, trees must be distributed in the garden in harmony with their natural origin and habit of growth. Historically, the idea of these unique gardens began during the 6th century in 538. That is over 1,300 years ago. Japanese merchants witnessed the gardens that were being built in China and brought many of the Chinese gardening techniques and styles back to Japan. Japanese gardens first appeared on the island of Honshu, which is the large central island of Japan. The Chinese garden had a very strong influence on early Japanese gardens. In 552 AD, Buddhism was officially installed from China via Korea into Japan. Starting in 600 and lasting more than 200 years, many diplomatic missions were sent from Japan to China. The diplomats, scholars, students, Buddhist monks, and translators brought back Chinese writing, art objects, and detailed descriptions of Chinese gardens. Their early aesthetic was influenced by the distinct characteristics of the Honshu landscape, again, the largest Japanese island, where there are rugged volcanic peaks, narrow valleys, mountain streams with waterfalls and cascades, lakes, and beaches of small stones. They were also influenced by the rich variety of flowers and different species of trees, particularly evergreens, and by the 4 distinct seasons, including hot, wet summers and snowy winters. Japanese gardens also have their roots in the Japanese religion of Shinto. Prehistoric Shinto shrines to the gods and spirits are found on beaches and in forests all over the island of Honshu. Prehistoric shrines often took the form of unusual rocks or trees marked with cords of rice fiber and surrounded with white stones or pebbles, a symbol of purity. The white gravel courtyard became a distinctive feature of Shinto shrines, imperial palaces, Buddhist temples, and ultimately Zen gardens, which we're going to be looking at. As with so many other cultures, art and garden design are inextricably intertwined. Ancient Japanese art inspired past garden designers, and by the period between 1603 and 1868, the Japanese garden had its own distinct appearance. This woodblock print, by the way, which I think most of you have probably seen, was sold for £75,650 at Bonham's in 2011. Essentially, the earliest recorded Japanese gardens were the pleasure gardens of the Japanese emperors and nobles. Here we see stones in the garden of the first Kyoto Imperial Palace. These stones were originally part of a 16th century bridge over the Kamo River near Kyoto, which was destroyed by an earthquake. In this woodcut, we see the ubiquitous red acer or maple, and one of the most iconic and also deciduous of the trees used in the Japanese garden. We also see a landscape which includes water and mountains. This combination we will see again and again in the Japanese garden, but represented by different elements. So let's take a closer look at the elements of a Japanese garden. And there are 3 essential elements, starting with, number 1, the permanence of stone. Secondly, plants for texture and color. And third, the soothing, reflective qualities of water. All are seen here in this very peaceful, tranquil scene. Now, note the little footbridge at the top of the picture, and also all the lovely moss. Moss grows best in shaded areas with lots of moisture. But if you provide those basic conditions, you can obviously grow moss in your garden. But have you, by any chance, heard of using buttermilk to create moss? It has to be buttermilk, not milk. which has a high acidity to encourage the moss to grow. Apparently, this really works. So let's first look at the element of water, which is very important in a Japanese garden. It symbolizes renewal, calm, wonder, as well as the source and origin of life. It is also a representation of the seas and oceans surrounding Japan. The delicacy and graceful bearing of the iris lining the stream are perfect examples of the quest for simple and refined beauty in both Japanese art and garden design. Most Japanese gardens have lakes or ponds or streams, and many have bridges. Here we can see two bridges, both covered with moss and both deceptively simple. Here, the bridge is of a more stylized construction. This one helps its visitors enjoy a view, as well as the presence of any fish in the pond. Bridges are privileged sites in a Japanese garden where one will linger and take in the beauty of the landscape, watch the carp swimming in their watery elements, and enjoy the softness of the breeze. Bridges can be built of wood, bamboo, earth, or stone, whether they are rounded, arc-shaped, or in zigzags. They always remain in harmony with the surrounding nature. These are koi, and the word literally means love or care in Japanese. Not only are these fish enjoyable to take care of, and I believe quite expensive, they are also helpful in controlling insects like mosquitoes. The brightly colored koi carp are literally living flowers. Now, interestingly, I could find no mention of any animals in a Japanese garden. No little footprints wrecking the raked gravel, no little foxes, stoats, or weasels, and not even birds. I'm sure there are, but I just didn't see them mentioned. Koi are indispensable inhabitants in the pond of any Japanese garden, bringing a flash of color to the shallow waters. Carp appeared in Japan many centuries ago, and they have been crossbred for over 100 years, producing fish of high value. Contests are held, and the fish are judged according to the number of spots, variety of colors, patterns on their bodies, and types of scales. We see many red bridges in Japanese gardens, and red is an important color in Japanese culture. Just think of their rising sun flag. And in this case, the red bridge represents wisdom, transformation, and all that is sacred. Japanese bridges, as with the Japanese gardens as a whole, are designed to offer a meditative and self-reflective experience. Most importantly, whether it be physical or spiritual, the Japanese bridge is a symbol of a journey. The subjectivity of this is key, as it allows for each visitor to experience this journey in whatever way they choose. Coming back to our three important elements, let's focus on plants. In contrast to the geometrically arranged trees and rocks of a Western-style garden, the Japanese garden traditionally creates a scenic composition that, as artlessly as possible, mimics nature. Pines are the most dominant native plant in Japan and the most important tree in Japanese gardens. They are strongly associated with Japan's original religion, Shintoism, which viewed pines as capable of attracting the gods. Pine trees symbolize perseverance in Japanese gardens. Pine trees are pruned regularly to keep their shapes in harmony with the surroundings. Some have an airy silhouette with widespread branches. Others are dense and compact, while still others lean over as if battered by the wind. This tree, pruned to look like a poodle, is a splendid example of a certain kind of pruning associated with Japanese gardens. It's called cloud pruning, or niwaki, and it describes a style of pruning trees to make them resemble clouds. Nail clippers come to mind. Part fantasy, part bonsai, part topiary, cloud pruning can be taken to extraordinary levels. As you can see, I got a little carried away with this type of tree pruning in Japanese gardens. Niwaki is like a form of bonsai, except the plants are not miniaturized. They are full size and they require a lot of pruning, and some of it looks pretty dangerous to me. Japanese gardens are designed to look natural, but are in fact cleverly fashioned stage sets with trees and shrubs carefully positioned, trained, shaped, and pruned to give exactly the right atmosphere, vista, or emotional impact. I included this slide as it reminds me of another garden that Garden Group have visited here in South Africa. This is the Dylan Lewis Sculpture Garden in Stellenbosch, and look how similar those pruned shrubs look to our previous slide. We visited this garden in September of 2016, and we were going back this year, but of course have had to postpone. Two other trees that deserve mention are the red maple or acer, which is much appreciated for its lacy leaves and magnificent autumn colors, making it a favorite in Japanese garden design. Here, gnarled pines, a red acer in autumn plumage, and the simple but beautiful stone basin with raked gravel highlight the less is more principle. We are going to be talking about gravel in a minute. And finally, again, here in autumnal magnificence, this big maple is just resplendent with color. Of course, here's the tree we all associate with Japan, a weeping cherry. In ancient Japan, farmers used the blooming of the cherry blossoms to help them know when it was time to plant their rice crops. The flowers were considered to be a representation of spring, hope, beauty, and new life. The significance of the cherry blossom tree in Japanese culture goes back hundreds of years and serves as a reminder that life is almost overwhelmingly beautiful, but that it is also tragically short. In the mid-19th century, a variety of cherry blossom known as Prunus X yedoensis was first introduced to Japan. From the late 19th century onward, its cultivation spread across Japan, resulting in it becoming the most abundant species of cherry tree. Note the beautiful stone on the left. Cherry trees actually originate from Turkey, or more widely, the region between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Here we see a tea room style garden with moss and gravel. Again, simplicity in nature, but the result of the controlling hand of man. You will have noticed thus far that flowers do not play a starring role in the Japanese garden. However, the lotus flower is an exception and an important element in Buddhist garden design, respected for its ability to provide beautiful blooms even in shallow, stagnant water. Wisteria is also an exception. Here we are looking at the wisteria flower tunnel at the Kawachi Fuji Garden, which is about 6 hours from Tokyo. Generally, it is shrubs and trees which provide the blooms. It can be said that Japanese gardens are definitely not picking gardens, such as English gardens. The beautiful arrangement is growing outside in nature and not for picking. Different garden styles have dominated different areas of Japanese history. And because there are many styles, we're only going to look at a few today. Specifically, we're going to look at Zen gardens, dry or rock gardens, also contemplation gardens and tea gardens. Each variety is worthy of days of study. So this is a whistle-stop tour. The Japanese were actually the first people to print and mass produce texts on books of garden designs, making the history of Japanese garden styles easy to trace. The first style is that of the Zen or dry landscape garden. And it is this type of garden that we can appreciate fully the importance of rocks and stone, the third important element. The Japanese rock garden, or dry landscape garden, often called a Zen garden, creates a miniature stylized landscape through carefully composed arrangements of rocks, water features, moss, prune trees, and bushes, and uses gravel or sand that is raked to represent ripples in water. Zen Buddhist monks created the first Zen gardens to aid in meditation in the 6th century. Later, they began using the gardens to teach Zen principles and concepts. Just as the Japanese tea ceremony and the ikebana flower arrangement makes frugality a virtue, creating with the simplest means a world of stillness and beauty, so the rock garden creates an ideal landscape, a garden for the mind. Up until the 14th century, dry landscape compositions were generally subsections of larger gardens or temple complexes. And it was only during the 14th century that they became independent garden designs. It is not until after the Second World War in the 1950s that the concept of gardens of gravel and sand and their surroundings as an expression of Zen even appears in the Japanese language. Zen gardens appeal to people who like carefully controlled settings of raked sand or rocks and precisely clipped shrubs. Zen gardens emphasize the principles of naturalness, simplicity, and austerity. They are nature-inspired, but heavily controlled and maintained. What they do teach us, though, is that no matter how much we try to control something, in the end, we are all at the whim of Mother Nature. And haven't we all learned that lesson these last few months? The symbolism of the stones in a Zen garden is one of the most important design elements. Upright or vertical stones can be used to represent trees, while flat horizontal stones represent water. This kind of garden features either rocks placed upright like mountains or laid out in a miniature landscape of hills and ravines with few plants. In Zen gardens, the gravel represents water, or like the white space in Japanese paintings, emptiness and distance. The result should encourage introspection and meditation. Raked gravel adds a textural element and helps to create or enhance ambience. Depending on the style and size of the ridges created, a softly lapping ocean or a rapidly flowing river may be invoked, and the ridges will catch the sun as it travels across the sky, providing onlookers with ever-changing panoramas. The lighter the hue of gravel, the more effective the garden will be under moonlight. How romantic is that? Raking the sand is also a Zen ploy used to assist the monks in putting aside daily concerns and personal thoughts. Raking the sand into intricate designs or even into straight and parallel lines takes enormous concentration. These designs are normally re-raked every 2 to 3 weeks using a variety of wooden zigzag or bamboo dowel rakes. Raking a gravel garden will keep it clean and orderly, and it also offers a form of meditation in motion. Here, a stretch of sea is running alongside this veranda in Kyoto. It is a misconception that all dry landscapes are void of flora. Moss and other evergreens often play a representational role, evoking the landscape rising out of the seas of sand. Dry landscape gardens are sometimes referred to as mental gardens or gardens of the mind. The rock garden's austere appearance echoes an intense spiritual striving, and indeed many of these rock gardens are places for the prolonged and rigorous practice of Zen meditation. The dry landscape garden has the added advantage that it is virtually impervious to extremes of weather and cannot be readily destroyed by fire, water, ice, or wind. Droughts do not harm it, nor do earthquakes damage it excessively. but a more practical reason for the prevalence of dry landscapes may have been simply the absence of natural springs or flowing water at the garden site. There was once this Zen master sitting on a small stone bench studying his small Japanese rock garden. There were only 5 rocks in the garden, each individually selected for perfection, patina, and harmony with the other 4. One day, a visitor is admiring the master's garden and complimenting his excellent taste. "How perfect it is," he exclaims at last. But the Zen master is not to be taken in, and he shakes his head, turns to his visitor and replies, "No, but it will be perfect when there are only 3 stones." This remarkable design evokes ocean waves, and clearly this space is not for walking about in, but for gazing at, thinking deeply, and contemplation. This style of Japanese garden, looking but not touching, is called the Contemplation Garden. The Contemplation or Meditation Garden was a spiritual sanctuary, a three-dimensional landscape designed to be viewed like a painting from a seated position in a room or on the veranda of a nearby building. In all cases, the essential idea is a garden for the spirit, designed to be toured mentally with the eye rather than with the legs. And by the way, you could never have a dog because you'd have footprints everywhere. And then there are tea gardens, which is another Japanese garden style. The process of preparing a guest for the tea ceremony is very methodical, so the tea garden must be laid out carefully and maintained meticulously. In creating it, there is a tendency toward the simple, the restrained or the reserved, and ponds and rock configurations are conspicuously absent. Gardens are designed to exude the everyday or the ordinary, and rock is used only for rustic stepping stone paths. The tea garden serves to disconnect those who enter it from worldly pomp and circumstance, to strip away cares and concerns, and to prepare them for the ritual of drinking tea with friends. The connection between serenity of nature and the drinking of tea comes from a sacred tradition, the Japanese tea ceremony, the origin of which dates back to the 13th century. Buddhist priests of the Zen sect found the tea useful in keeping them awake during midnight devotions. Today, the heart of the tradition is the elegant making and pouring of whipped green tea, also called matcha. When the ceremony is well executed, an unspoken and perhaps inexpressible Zen quality lingers in the air. As tea ceremonies became more widespread, they eventually became associated with the presence of nature, more specifically with the presence of a garden. Over time, the tea house became the transcendent viewing place for contemplating the landscape. Having explored styles and elements of Japanese gardens, we are now going to visit some specific gardens, and it seems only right to begin with one that is considered one of the best in Japan. This is the Adachi Museum of Art, which is best known for its award-winning garden. It has been named the best garden in Japan annually since 2003 by the Journal of Japanese Gardening. Its founder was a man called Adachi Zenko, who was a Japanese industrialist, philanthropist, and entrepreneur, and who came from very humble beginnings near the site of the museum. Born in 1899, he became successful in many business endeavors, including textiles and property. As his success grew, he began collecting works of art by Japanese painters, something he had loved since his youth, and eventually he was known as an art collector. Designing gardens, something he had loved above all else since his youth, became a passion. Finally, in 1970, at the age of 71, as a way of showing gratitude to his hometown and to enhance its cultural development, Adachi established the Adachi Museum of Art. He felt a strong resonance between the sublime sensibility of the Japanese-style garden and his collection of paintings, which he wished visitors to experience. Adachi constructed his Japanese garden with the hope that through its seasonal expression of natural beauty, visitors would be inspired to view his paintings with a renewed sense of appreciation. He believed that the garden is also a picture, and he devoted himself to gardening until he died at the age of 91 in 1990. The 6 gardens at the museum, including the dry landscape garden, are about 165,000 square meters in total. They show various seasonal phases and have good balance with the surrounding natural mountains. Thus, Adachi's gardens are said to be living Japanese paintings. They are the ultimate contemplation gardens designed to be seen and not walked through. In fact, they are paintings or living landscapes you can only see from behind the glass windows of the museum. I think Mr. Adachi knew what he was doing. Now changing continents and zooming to North America, this is the tea house of the most famous Japanese garden in the United States, called the Japanese Tea Garden in San Francisco, and it's a popular feature of the Golden Gate Park. Originally built as part of a sprawling World's Fair in 1894. It is the oldest public Japanese garden in the US, and it is a complex of many paths, ponds, and a tea house, as well as plants, trees, which have been pruned and arranged in a Japanese style. The garden's 3 acres contain sculptures and structures influenced by Buddhist and Shinto religious beliefs, as well as many elements of water and rocks to create a calming landscape designed to slow people down. The tea garden began as the Japanese village and tea garden at the 1894 World's Fair, and it was built by an Australian-born guy named George Turner Marsh, who hired a Japanese craftsman to construct the site. After the close of the fair, Marsh sold his concession to the city of San Francisco for $4,500. Mr. Makoto Hajiwara, a Japanese immigrant and gardener, was then hired to manage the garden. When the fair closed, Mr. Hajiwara became the caretaker of the property, pouring all his personal wealth, passion, and creative talents into maintaining and extending a garden of utmost perfection. He was the official caretaker until 1925 and imported many plants, birds, and the now famous koi fish from Japan, and he more than tripled the size of the garden. Following Mr. Hajiwara's death in 1925, his daughter, Takano Hajiwara, and her children became the proprietors and maintainers of the garden until 1942, when they, along with about 120,000 Japanese Americans, were forced to evacuate their homes and move into internment camps. Following the war, the Hajiwaras were not allowed to return to their home in the park, nor were they reimbursed after the war ended. In the period of their absence, the garden was renamed the Oriental Tea Garden, and some structures expressing Japanese sentiment were demolished, including the Hajiwara home and the original Shinto shrine. Japanese tea servers were replaced with Chinese women in their traditional dress. The Japanese Tea Garden in San Francisco regained its name after the war in 1952, and the Hajiwara family was allowed to continue to assist in the maintenance of the garden. Tea gardens are places of sacred rituals. They're meant to represent Japanese religion through the art created by the landscape and the architecture. In the Japanese Tea Garden in San Francisco, you'll be able to see Buddhism, Shintoism, and Taoism religion in its design. These religions all emphasize the importance of being one with nature. To do this, everything in the garden is placed in a specific way to establish a feeling of flow, relaxation, and peace. This is the famous drum bridge at the San Francisco Tea Garden. And it's called the drum bridge because it looks like someone cut a large drum in half and used it as a bridge. It was actually made in Japan and dismantled to be brought to San Francisco. But the World's Fair Expo ran out of money and the completion of the bridge was stalled. The Japanese architect of the bridge, not Mr. Hajiwara, this is another man, then returned to Japan to sell off his land holdings. And using his own money, he came back to San Francisco to complete the project. The end result is something that looks beautiful and terribly impractical. The slope of the bridge is so steep that you have to literally climb it. Fortunately, it has footholds on it. Otherwise, you'd need a pair of cleats. The steepness of the bridge forces the visitor to slow down, allegedly to prepare for the tea ceremony. Having visited this garden in September of 2013, I can attest to the natural beauty, tranquility, and harmony. When you visit San Francisco, I recommend you go. And now we are going to fly over the continental US to the East Coast, to a small island which I hold dear in my heart. We are going to one of the original 13 colonies, the state of Massachusetts in New England. And we are heading south from Boston to the third garden we are going to visit, which is on the island of Martha's Vineyard, where I normally am at this time of year. This map shows you both the Vineyard and Nantucket, just south of the sweep of the arm of Cape Cod. Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard are sort of like Neisner and Plettenberg Bay. You are either one or the other, but not both. Here's a map of Martha's Vineyard, and the garden we are going to visit is actually on the adjoining and small island of Chappaquiddick, which is off to the east side of Martha's Vineyard. So it's an island off of an island, and you really have to want to get there to get there. For starters, you have to take a 45-minute ferry ride from the mainland, then drive about 30 minutes to Edgartown, where you take another much smaller ferry called the On Time, because it's not. And then you have to either drive or walk at least 3 miles from the Chappie ferry landing. This garden is called My Toy on Chappaquiddick, which, as you may remember, is where the late Senator Ted Kennedy drove off the Dyke Bridge in July 1969. While he managed to survive, his passenger, Mary Jo Kopechne, did not. She drowned in the back of the car, and so did the presidential aspirations of Senator Ted Kennedy. The clue is in the address of My Toy, 41 Dyke Road. Chappie, as we all call it, only has a year-round population of about 100 people. Most houses built there are vacation homes. The remoteness of Chappaquiddick is one of its main draws, and its remoteness has helped it to retain its timeless charm. This is not the Dyke Bridge, but a red bridge in My Toy. In 1954, a woman called Mary Wakeman purchased land in Chappaquiddick for a summer home and hired Edgartown architect Hugh Jones to design a Japanese-style house for her. As payment, she sold him a 3-acre parcel across the road from her house for $1. Jones had developed a love of Japanese gardens during his military service. He began his own Japanese-style garden by scooping out a pond in the midst of the pitch pine forest and building a little red bridge. He planted rhododendrons, azaleas, and junipers. He did all the landscaping and planting himself, and he spent so much time on his garden that he referred to it as his toy. He named the garden My Toy, which is spelled M-Y-T-O-I. Today, real estate on Chappaquiddick is a little more expensive than $1 an acre. A 3-acre wooded lot, not on the water, is currently selling for $1,395,000. When Jones died in 1965, his heirs sold the property back to Mrs. Wakeman, who managed the garden and provided free access to the public. She then donated the garden along with an endowment, and its additional 11 acres of land to a conservation organization called Trustees of Reservations. This was all done in 1976. The Trustees of Reservations is the oldest land conservation nonprofit organization of its kind in the world, and it has 140,000 dues-paying members as of 2018. Now, there is a rumor or a legend and a long-held suspicion that there is somehow a connection between the My Toy Garden and the tragedy that occurred on the Dyke Bridge. Who knows if it's true? And I repeat, this is a rumor and it's not substantiated. But when the Kennedy family and Senator Ted Kennedy's political machine were scrambling to protect him, that somehow My Toy received an anonymous gift from the Kennedy family. We will probably never know, and it may not be true. In any case, My Toy is a perfectly lovely garden, here seen in the autumn. And should you find yourself in Martha's Vineyard, My Toy is a really wonderful way to spend an afternoon. The most basic element of any Japanese garden design comes from the realization that every detail has a significant value. Japanese gardens are certainly very different from the gardens of the West. And as the world becomes more crowded and difficult, it may be to this style of garden that we will all be drawn. The American poet May Sarton said, quote, "Everything that slows us down and forces patience, everything that sets us back into the slow circles of nature is a help. Gardening is an instrument of grace," quote. I will leave you with this incredibly beautiful and simple view of a dry garden. And thank you so much for coming on this journey with me today.
That was beautiful. Thanks, Margie.
That's brilliant. When are we going?
Oh, great. Hi, Patty.
Hi, Patty.
We're up to 36 people. That's great. Thanks. Thanks so much, everyone.
I'm so glad it's being recorded because I want to watch it.
So if you've been to Japan, raise your hand.
If you've been to Japan. When are we going, Margie?
Yes, good question.
Good question, but I would really love to see Japanese gardens. And it's a real bucket list thing for me. So
yeah. I just want to say I've given a lot of lectures on Japanese gardens in Cape Town at the University Summer School, and I've taken tour groups to Japan. If you want to go, let me know. I've been to many of the gardens you showed in Japan, and I know them well. What was so interesting for me was the American ones that I have not visited, and the stories behind them. So for me, that was fantastic.
Well, Suzanne, I am humbled by your much greater experience and knowledge. And that's why I said this is, if anything, hoping to be lightly informative and certainly not scholarly. But
it was lovely, a lovely lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Margaret. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I don't know.
Perfect.
Ladies, I'm thinking this is really so much fun for me, and I learn a lot, that I am going to do an August lecture.
Yay!
I'm thinking of doing it on the history of the tulip.
Oh, yes.
Oh,
wow.
Yeah.
Whoa.
So I guess I can't back out of it now.
Well done.
Margaret, I don't know if you saw Monty Don's Japanese gardens. He did two Gardeners World programs on Japanese garden. One was a spring garden, one was a autumn garden. So look at those sometime.
I will. I definitely will. There is such a wealth of information on this. And there are thousands and thousands of Japanese gardens, and it's just an incredibly huge topic. I was quite daunted to begin with.
Oh, well done.
Yeah.
Well done, Margaret. Thank you.
Oh,
Thank
it's a
you,
pleasure,
Margaret.
everyone. It's a
It's
pleasure.
fabulous
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
presentation.
Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
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 Thank you.
Bye.